So I want you to just put yourself in this incredibly specific scenario for a second. Imagine you're the king of this, like, really tiny mountainous nation, right?
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. And you're standing up on the limestone walls of your capital city, just looking out at the horizon. And you literally see the world's most brutal, technologically advanced military empire building massive dirt siege ramps right up to your gates.
Just an absolute nightmare scenario.
Completely. I mean, they've already burned all the cities down the road. They've impaled your neighbors. You can hear their armor, their war machines, and their commanders are actually shouting at your starving people in your own native language.
Right, telling them that they've been completely abandoned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what do you do? I mean, do you call for your generals? Do you surrender and just, offer yourself up as a slave? Or do you desperately try to forge some kind of political alliance with another empire?
You'd think it would have to be one of those options.
Right. But according to the ancient texts we are jumping into today, you are actually supposed to do none of those things. The advice given to this terrified king by his chief advisor was to do the absolute unthinkable. He told him to just sit quietly, do nothing, and wait.
Which is, I mean, it is an almost incomprehensible geopolitical strategy to the modern mind.
It sounds insane.
It really does. We are so conditioned to believe that, survival requires action, it requires armament and aggressive diplomacy, but the text we are unpacking today completely short-circuits that entire assumption.
It really throws it out the window.
Yeah, it demands a posture that looks to literally any rational military commander,
Right.
like absolute suicide. And that tension, that friction between the terrifying physical reality of an invading army and this radical, almost offensive demand for quiet trust, that is the engine that drives this entire anthology.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We're so incredibly thrilled to have you here with us. We are taking on a massive, really rich exploration of the book of Isaiah.
That's a big one.
Oh, it's huge. Our mission today is to unpack what is arguably the most sweeping, the most structurally complex, and undoubtedly the most influential text in the ancient biblical canon.
And we should clarify, this isn't just some dry religious study for academics in tweed jackets. Right?
No, definitely not. We are exploring an ancient anthology that forcefully collides this brutal historical realism with these soaring, mind-bending, almost cosmic flights of poetry. I mean, we have invading empires.
They have biting social justice critiques that honestly sound like they were pulled right from today's headlines.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, ancient psychological warfare and prophecies that quite literally redefined what power means in human history.
To really understand the stakes here, you have to realize that Isaiah functions as a profound theological hinge.
A hinge, I like that.
Yeah, it is the definitive pivot point between the absolute collapse of an old world order, a world where people found their security in kings, in massive stone temples and political alliances, and the distant, seemingly impossible hope of a completely new kind of redemptive renewal.
So it's not just a history book.
Not at all. It doesn't just record history. It aggressively interprets history while the world is actively falling apart around them. It tells you exactly why the city is burning.
And it's exactly why this matters to you listening right now. Whether you are, a theology student prepping for a seminar or a history buff who loves the gritty, tactile details of ancient warfare.
Or just someone trying to understand how human beings cope with overwhelming political and social collapse.
Right, because this deep dive is going to offer a lot of clarity on that. When you strip away the ancient setting, this is fundamentally an exploration of human nature. It's like a mirror reflecting our fear, our deeply ingrained pride, and our desperate pursuit of justice when the systems we built start to fracture.
But, I mean, to even begin to grasp the soaring, hopeful poetry that comes later in this text, you first have to understand the sheer, unadulterated terror of the historical moment it was born into.
The context is everything.
It really is. The theology of Isaiah is forged in a furnace of absolute trauma. You simply cannot separate the spiritual message from the physical nightmare of the 8th century BCE.
Okay, so let's drop right into that nightmare. Let's move from this 30,000-foot conceptual overview down into the dirt and the blood of the ancient Near East. We are stepping into what can only be described as the imperial meat grinder.
The imperial meat grinder. That is a very apt description. The geopolitical landscape of the 8th century BCE is incredibly volatile. If we look at the map of the ancient Near East at this time, the Kingdom of Judah, where Isaiah is actually located, specifically in the capital city of Jerusalem, It is incredibly small.
Like tiny, right?
Geographically and militarily, yes. It is a microscopic player on a massive, violent chessboard.
It's essentially just a speed bump on the coastal highway between superpowers.
That is a very, very accurate way to visualize it. Judah is being squeezed and pressured from every possible direction. So to the north, you have the rival sister kingdom of Israel, which is often referred to as Ephraim in the text.
Okay, so Israel is to the north.
Right. And further north of them, you have Aram Damascus. Then to the west, on the coast, you have Philistia. Down to the south, the ancient, looming, incredibly wealthy superpower of Egypt.
So they are completely boxed in.
Completely. But the real nightmare, the dark cloud that is methodically moving across the entire horizon from the east, is Assyria.
The Assyrian Empire. And we need to be really clear about who these people were. They were not just, conquerors seeking to expand their borders and collect taxes. They were ancient terrorists.
Absolutely. They utilized highly organized, state-sponsored terror to subdue populations long before their troops even arrived at the city gates.
Yeah, their entire military strategy relied on their reputation.
They turned brutality into a literal administrative tool. So Isaiah is firmly anchored in this Assyrian age. We are looking at a text engaged in ultimate crisis management in the face of total annihilation.
Right, because there are three major historical crisis points that define this era and basically force the prophets to speak up.
Right. Yes. The first is the Syro-Ephraimite War, which takes place around 734 to 732 BCE. This is a situation where Judah's northern neighbors, Israel and Aram, try to force Judah into an anti-Assyrian military coalition.
Okay, so the neighborhood is basically trying to unionize against the mob boss.
That's a great way to put it.
And when Judah, under King Ahaz, refuses to join the coalition, those neighbors turn around and invade Judah themselves, right?
Yeah.
Just to install a puppet king who will play ball.
Exactly.
So you are literally being attacked by your own brothers just because you won't join them to fight the bigger bully.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It is wild. And that internal squabbling is ultimately pointless anyway, because the Assyrian machine cannot be stopped by some tiny regional coalition. So in 722 BCE, the unthinkable happens. The fall of Samaria.
This is a huge deal.
Massive.
Yeah.
The northern kingdom of Israel is utterly wiped off the map by the Assyrian army. The capital is destroyed and the population is deported. 10 entire tribes of Israel are essentially erased from history, scattered out into the empire.
So the buffer zone is just gone.
Poof, gone. The Assyrian border is now pressed right up against Judah's neck.
Which culminates in the event I mentioned at the very beginning of our deep dive 701 BCE, Sennacherib's terrifying siege of Jerusalem. And what is so incredible to me about this moment is that we don't just have to rely on the biblical text for this.
Right, we have the external evidence.
We have the receipts from the other side. The archaeology here is wild.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Taylor Prism.
Oh, the Taylor Prism, also known as Sennacherib's Prism, is just a phenomenal piece of archaeological evidence. It's this hexagonal clay artifact dating to about 691 BCE, and it was discovered in the ruins of Nineveh.
And what exactly does it say?
It serves as an official Assyrian royal inscription, basically detailing Sennacherib's military campaigns. And on this specific prism, Sennacherib openly brags about his campaign against Judah. He talks about trapping King Hezekiah in Jerusalem.
And the wording he uses is so specific, isn't it?
It is. The exact phrase translated from the Akkadian is that he shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage.
Like a bird in a cage. I mean, it's such a chilling, dismissive metaphor. It implies total control, total helplessness on Hezekiah's part.
Completely. It also lists the massive, extortionate tribute Hezekiah had to pay. We're talking gold, silver, ivory, just to keep Sennacherib from burning the city to the ground.
So it is external, undeniable corroboration for the exact Assyrian crisis we read about in Isaiah chapters 36 and 37.
Yes. And beyond the written record, we have the visual record, which is arguably much, much more disturbing. I'm talking about the Lachish reliefs.
Okay, yes. Tell us about the Lachish reliefs.
These are massive, intricately carved stone panels from Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, which are actually currently housed in the British Museum. They provide this visual, almost frame-by-frame narrative of the Assyrian army laying siege to Lachish.
And Lachish was Judah's second most important city, right? Heavily fortified.
Yes.
And it's only about, 30 miles down the road for Jerusalem? So if Lachish falls, Jerusalem knows it's absolutely next.
Exactly. The reliefs are a masterclass in ancient propaganda. They show you exactly how the Assyrian war machine operated. You see the massive earthen siege ramps being built against the city walls.
The same ones you mentioned earlier.
Right. You see the wheeled battering rams with these long spear-like points chipping away at the stone. You see lines of archers providing covering fire. And then you see the brutal aftermath.
Which is pretty horrific.
It is. The reliefs depict Judean leaders being flayed alive. They show citizens being impaled on stakes right outside the city. They show lines of exhausted families carrying whatever meager belongings they could grab, being marched off into exile.
So this wasn't abstract history. This was the literal, visual fate waiting for Jerusalem. It illuminates exactly what the people standing on those walls were staring down.
They knew exactly what was happening 30 miles away.
Which brings up a really concrete physical detail about how the leaders in Jerusalem reacted. Because they were just sitting in the temple praying, they were panicking, and they were prepping. We have to talk about Hezekiah's tunnel.
Ah, yes. Also known as the Siloam Tunnel, a truly remarkable feat of late 8th century BCE engineering.
And a perfect physical representation of the city's desperation.
Absolutely.
Because King Hezekiah knew this siege was coming, and the biggest vulnerability for Jerusalem was water. The main water source, the Gihon Spring, was outside the defensive walls.
Right, so if the Assyrians surround the city, they just cut off the water and the city dies of thirst in a matter of weeks.
Exactly. So Hezekiah has his engineers carved this massive winding tunnel through solid bedrock to channel the water safely into the pool of Siloam, which was inside the city walls.
And they dug it from both ends simultaneously, meeting in the middle deep under the rock, which is just astonishing. They were frantically altering the very geography of their city to survive the Assyrian machine.
It's basically ancient doomsday prepping.
Ouch.
They're digging into the earth, hoarding resources, completely terrified of the empire.
Yeah.
But, and this is where the text of Isaiah pulls a massive bait and switch, this is what trips me out. Well, if you were a prophet in Jerusalem, and you have these massive existential physical threats, battering rams, impalements, an empire that literally wants to erase you from history, why does Isaiah seem so obsessively focused on Judah's internal behavior?
That is the core question.
Right, because you read the first few chapters, and he's not giving geopolitical analysis of Assyrian troop movements. He's furious about how the people in Jerusalem are treating each other. Why ignore the massive army at the gates to talk about, like, local court corruption?
Because Isaiah's worldview is fundamentally different from our modern political calculus. In the modern world, we tend to view external political and military disasters as historical accidents, right? Just the result of shifting power dynamics or resource scarcity.
Sure, geopolitics.
Exactly. But in Isaiah's theology, the external military disaster is directly, causally linked to internal covenant failure. The empire is just a symptom. The societal sin is the actual disease.
Wait. So the prophet is telling the people that the Assyrian army is building siege ramps outside because of what the citizens are doing inside the city walls.
Yes, exactly that. Isaiah operates on this uncompromising premise that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is sovereign over all nations. He governs the empires. So Assyria, as terrifying as it is not some independent actor ruining God's plan.
Assyria is just a tool.
Yes. Isaiah chapter 10 uses a brilliant metaphor for this. It says Assyria is just a rod of anger in God's hand. Therefore, the real threat to Judah isn't Sennacherib's army at all. The real threat is the internal systemic rot that has provoked the divine judgment in the first place.
Man, that completely flips the script.
It does. It means that if God decides to protect the city, Assyria can do absolutely nothing. They are powerless against the divine will. But if God abandons the city because of its internal corruption, all the water tunnels and reinforced walls in the world won't save them.
So if God is demanding this intense internal purity, and he's willing to use a brutal empire to enforce it, we have to ask, what exactly was that internal rot? What could possibly be so bad that God would orchestrate the destruction of his own people?
To understand that, we have to look at the opening chapters, which pivot forcefully inward. We are presented with a society that is deeply systemically broken. But, and it's crucial to realize this wasn't an overtly atheistic or secular society.
They hadn't abandoned religion.
Not at all. They were still going to the temple. They were still offering the sacrifices.
Right. The text is very clear that they were still observing the new moons, holding the festivals, burning the incense. They thought they were doing everything right on paper.
They maintained the mechanics of worship perfectly, but Isaiah comes in and delivers a devastating critique. In chapter 1, he essentially condemns all of it as hypocritical liturgy.
Hypocritical liturgy, that's a strong phrase.
It is. God speaks through the prophet and says, I've had enough of your burnt offerings. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. It is a profound statement.
So the religious rituals had just become a smokescreen.
Exactly. They were using religious performance to cover up profound social and economic abuse.
So what were the actual abuses? When Isaiah pulls back the curtain, what is the iniquity hiding behind the smoke of the altar?
Isaiah exposes a highly stratified society where the leadership has entirely abandoned Torah-shaped justice in favor of luxury consumption and aggressive wealth hoarding. We see rampant land accumulation, the blatant exploitation of the poor, incredibly corrupt courts where judges just take bribes, and the staggering arrogance of the societal elite.
Let's get into the mechanics of that, because this is where the original language really unlocks the text. The ethical force of Isaiah hinges on two very specific Hebrew words, doesn't it?
Yes, the entire critique is built on the absence of two concepts, mishapa and andakwa. The first word, mishaf, is usually translated in English Bibles as justice or legal order.
Okay, but we have to be very careful not to just map our modern Western ideas of justice onto this ancient Hebrew concept, right?
Absolutely not. They are very different.
Because when I hear justice, I immediately think of the blindfolded lady holding the scales. You know, the Greco-Roman idea of impartial, abstract fairness. The law applies equally to the billionaire and the homeless person. It's blind.
Right. For the modern West, ideal justice is abstract and blind. But in the ancient Near East, and specifically within the biblical covenant, Mishad is not blind at all. It has its eyes wide open, and it is specifically looking for the vulnerable.
It's actively looking out for them.
Yes, it is active, interventionist legal protection for the politically and economically exposed. The text constantly references the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor. Mishah is about righting the power imbalances that naturally accrue in any human society.
So if a wealthy landowner is using a legal loophole to take a poor farmer's land, Mishab requires the judge to actively intervene and protect the farmer, not just rigidly enforce the letter of the contract.
Exactly. It's not just about rules. It's about protection.
It's like an aggressive safety net.
Yeah.
And what about the second word?
The second word is eidakwa, which is often translated as righteousness. And again, we have to strip away our modern baggage here.
Because we usually think of righteousness as just like personal morality.
Right, just private morality, personal piety, or sexual ethics. But in this context, it means right ordering under God. It's a massive holistic concept. It means living in a way that actively promotes the flourishing of the entire community according to God's original design.
It's basically the fabric of a healthy society.
It is. And when Isaiah looks at Jerusalem, he sees a complete, catastrophic absence of both Mishita and Adak.
There is a devastating piece of poetry in Isaiah chapter 5 that illustrates this perfectly, the vineyard allegory. Can we walk through the mechanics of that metaphor?
Yes.
Because it paints this picture of societal collapse so vividly.
Oh, it's one of the most brilliant and tragic parables in the entire Hebrew Bible. Isaiah steps up, perhaps at a public festival, and starts singing a song about a friend who plants a vineyard on a very fertile hill.
And he describes all the intense labor involved.
Right. Yes. The friend clears the stones, plants the absolute choicest vines, builds a stone watchtower to protect it, and hews out a wine vat right in the bedrock. He invests immense care, time, and resources into this vineyard, fully expecting it to yield beautiful, sweet grapes.
And the listeners would immediately understand the agricultural reality of this. A vineyard is a huge long-term investment. You don't get a crop overnight. And the vineyard obviously represents Judah. It represents the people of God.
Yes, precisely. God is the vine dresser. He has carefully cultivated this nation, given them the law, protected them. But when the time comes for the harvest, the text says the vineyard yields only wild, rotten, sour grapes.
The crop is a total failure.
A total failure. And the ecological ruin in the metaphor is directly linked to the moral collapse of the society. In the Hebrew of chapter 5, verse 7, Isaiah uses a brilliant, tragic wordplay that hits the listener like a punch to the gut.
How does the wordplay work in the original Hebrew?
Isaiah says God looked for justice, mishah, but behold, bloodshed, mishah. He looked for righteousness, the deka, but behold, a cry of distress, neka.
Wow. Mishup and Mishua. Idaka and Neka. They sound almost identical, but the meanings are absolute opposites.
Exactly. God looked for a society protecting the weak, and instead, He heard the screams of the exploited.
The very leaders who were supposed to be the safety net had become the predators. And to really grasp how offensive this was, we have to remember the cultural structure of ancient Israel. This wasn't a modern nation state of, anonymous citizens living in high-rises.
No, the nation was understood entirely in familial terms. It was a kinship-based society. Extended households, clan identity, tribal lineage.
That is a crucial sociological point. It means that when the elites were engaged in land theft, when they were foreclosing on the ancestral farming plots of the poor due to debt vulnerability, they weren't just exploiting nameless peasants in a different tax bracket.
They were betraying their own extended family.
Yes, they were destroying the fabric of their own kinship network. I was trying to think of a modern equivalent to capture the sheer hypocrisy of this.
What did you come up with?
It's like, imagine the most elite, wealthy leaders of a city hosting a massive, high society charity gala. They're dressed to the nines, the cameras are flashing, they're giving these flowery speeches about their deep faith, lifting their hands in prayer, paying lip service to how blessed they are.
Setting the scene.
Right. But behind the scenes, they're simultaneously foreclosing on the homes of the very working-class people who set up the tables, cook the food, and park their cars. They are literally using the charity event as a PR shield to hide their ruthless business practices.
That is exactly the dynamic Isaiah is attacking. The temple sacrifices were the ancient equivalent of that charity gala. And this brings us to another vital foundational concept in Isaiah, the holiness of God.
The holiness of God. The Hebrew word is kadosh, right? Meaning holy, separate, or totally other.
Yes, quado. But in Isaiah, God's holiness is not just a passive, static state of being detached from the dirty human world. It is a blazing, active, moral purity.
Blazing moral purity, that implies a reaction. I mean, if something is a blazing fire, it burns anything corrupt that gets too close to it.
Precisely. And because God is quados, because his nature is absolute justice and purity, worship that is detached from justice is not just inadequate, it is actively offensive to him. It provokes his wrath.
Wow.
The theological test case of the entire book of Isaiah is this. How a society treats its most vulnerable, easily exploited members is the ultimate undeniable measure of its religious validity. You simply cannot claim to love a holy God while systematically crushing the people made in his image.
That is a critique that cuts right through 2,700 years of history. It lands right on our doorstep today. So put yourself in the shoes of the king of Judah. You are facing an internal systemic crisis of inequality and corruption that is literally provoking the wrath of God.
Right.
And simultaneously, you have an invading Assyrian meat grinder marching toward your borders, which God is using as the instrument of that wrath. That is the ultimate impossible test of leadership. So how did the actual politicians in charge handle that pressure cooker?
Well, to answer that, the book transitions from pure prophetic poetry into a historical narrative block, specifically chapters 36 through 39, along with the preceding historical context in chapter 7.
It gives us some concrete examples.
Exactly. The text presents us with a profound evaluation of leadership by giving us a tale of two very different kings facing similar imperial threats, King Ahaz and King Hezekiah.
Let's start with Ahaz, who rules during that earlier crisis, the Syro-Ephraimite War. Ahaz represents what we could call faithless political pragmatism.
Ahaz is on the throne when Judah's northern neighbors, Israel and Aram, form their coalition and invade Judah to force them to join the rebellion against Assyria. Isaiah chapter 7 sets the scene perfectly.
He's terrified, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely. The text gives us this vivid psychological detail. It says, his heart and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind.
Total panic. And Isaiah the prophet walks right up to the king and basically says, stop, don't panic, trust Yahweh. These two invading kings are nothing. They're just two smoldering stumps of firewood. They're going to burn out and disappear. Just hold your ground.
But Ahaz completely ignores the prophet, doesn't he?
He completely ignores him because Ahaz is acting like a modern secular politician. He looks at the geopolitical map, he runs the military calculus, and he decides to appeal to the biggest, most violent bully on the block for protection.
He takes matters into his own hands.
Right. He takes the gold and silver from the temple and the royal palace, and he sends it as tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III, the king of Assyria. He essentially writes a letter saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me.
He voluntarily submits to the empire. He invites the wolf into the sheepfold just to chase away the wild dogs.
And in the short term, from a purely political perspective, his strategy works. Assyria marches down, crushes the northern coalition, and destroys Aram.
But the long-term cost is catastrophic. Judah is now a vassal state to Assyria. They have lost their independence. Ahaz traded faith in God for a false, temporary, and deeply compromising political security.
And then we contrast that failure with Hezekiah. Hezekiah is the better but fallible king. He represents a completely different approach to crisis.
Hezekiah inherits the absolute mess that his father Ahaz made. Decades later, by 701 BCE, the Assyrians are no longer the protectors you can hire. They are the invaders arriving to collect.
Right, they are under the command of Sennacherib now. Assyria has destroyed Lachish, the siege ramps are built, and now they surround Jerusalem. We get this incredible, chilling scene in Isaiah 26 of ancient psychological warfare.
This is the scene with the Rabshakeh. And we should probably explain who that is. The Rabshakeh isn't a name, it's a title. He's basically the Assyrian chief of staff, or the supreme field commander.
He is the mouthpiece of the empire.
And he is an absolute master of propaganda. He stands outside the walls of Jerusalem, well within earshot of the defenders on the wall.
And what's crazy about this is the language he uses. In the ancient world, diplomatic negotiations between empires were conducted in Aramaic, right? The lingua franca of the day.
Yes. The Judean officials actually beg the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic, so the common soldiers on the wall won't understand. But he refuses. He deliberately shouts at the top of his lungs in Hebrew, the native language of the Judeans.
It is a calculated tactic of total demoralization. He wants every starving soldier on that wall to hear exactly how doomed they are.
He systematically dismantles every single pillar of their hope. He mocks their military preparations. He mocks their frantic attempts to form an alliance with Egypt, calling Egypt a splintered reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it.
That's such a visceral image. If you lean on Egypt for support, they will just impale your hand. They are completely useless.
But then he employs his most terrifying weapon. He claims a theological mandate.
He weaponizes their own religion against them. He says, "Do you think I have come up against this land to destroy it without Yahweh? Yahweh himself said to me, go up against this land and destroy it."
That is a psychological kill shot.
A kill shot. He's telling them that their own God has switched sides. So how does King Hezekiah respond to this? Does he raid the temple treasury again and try to buy off Sennacherib like his father did?
The contrast is striking, and it's profound. When Hezekiah hears the words of the Rabshakeh, he doesn't call a war council. He doesn't send out diplomats. He tears his royal robes, puts on sackcloth, the garment of mourning and repentance, and he goes straight into the temple, the house of the Lord.
He takes it straight to God.
He takes the threatening, blasphemous letter from the Assyrians, and he literally spreads it out on the floor before Yahweh. He prays. He acknowledges the terrifying reality that Assyria has indeed laid waste to all other nations and burned their gods.
But he appeals to Yahweh as the one true creator God, right?
Yeah.
Asking for deliverance, not just for survival, but so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord.
Exactly. He makes it about God's reputation, not his own survival. And the outcome is completely miraculous. God responds through Isaiah. He promises to defend the city.
And then what happens?
That very night, a catastrophic event described as an angel of the Lord, perhaps a plague or some sudden disaster, strikes the Assyrian camp. The siege is broken, Sennacherib packs up and goes home to Nineveh. Jerusalem is saved without firing a single arrow.
Wow. It is this profound historical vindication of a core theme in the book, trust versus alliances.
Yes. Throughout chapters 30 and 31, Isaiah repeatedly, aggressively warns the political leaders not to seek honor, security, and patronage from foreign powers, particularly Egypt.
The politicians in Jerusalem wanted military horses. They wanted chariots. They wanted the political machinery of the empire.
But Isaiah tells them those are false saviors. They are trusting in the shadow of Egypt instead of the shadow of the Almighty.
There's an incredible line from Isaiah 30, verse 15, that captures this entire theology perfectly. "In returning and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength." And I have to push back on this because my 21st century brain really struggles with the practical application here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Wait, isn't Ahaz, the bad king, actually just being a smart, pragmatic politician? If a brutal empire is marching toward your city, intending to impale your citizens and enslave your children, isn't it your fundamental duty as a king to secure weapons, build fortifications, and make military alliances?
It seems like common sense.
Exactly. Isaiah is telling them to just sit quietly and trust. In the real world, Isn't that literal military suicide?
To understand Isaiah's logic, we really have to grasp the mechanics of the biblical covenant. You are applying modern, secular, realpolitik, the idea that power is derived solely from physical force, to an ancient theocratic covenant.
Okay, so I'm using the wrong framework.
Right. In the biblical worldview, relying on the military might of Egypt or the political patronage of Assyria instead of Yahweh is not just a policy disagreement, it is spiritual adultery.
Spiritual adultery.
Right.
Explain how a military treaty equals adultery.
The covenant established between God and Israel at Mount Sinai was explicitly framed as a marriage contract. God promised to be their ultimate protector and provider, conditionally based on their faithfulness to him and his laws of justice.
So when they seek outside help.
When Judah's leaders panic and send envoys to Egypt to buy chariots, they are fundamentally declaring that God is either unwilling or unable to keep his promises. They are turning to a former abuser Egypt, the place of their original enslavement, for salvation.
Wow, turning to their former abuser.
Yes, they are breaking the first commandment. In Isaiah's theology, true security only comes from covenant fidelity. To rely on human empires is to guarantee your own destruction, because all empires are built on pride, violence, and exploitation, which God actively opposes.
Okay, so trust is actually the ultimate, most realistic geopolitical strategy, because God actually controls the board. But you mentioned earlier that Hezekiah was a fallible king. He gets this massive victory in chapter 37, but he doesn't end well, does he?
No, he doesn't. Right at the end of this historical section, in chapter 39, Hezekiah makes a fatal error. He falls gravely ill, miraculously recovers, and the king of Babylon, which is currently just a rising power, not yet the dominant empire, sends envoys to congratulate him.
And Hezekiah, perhaps caught in a moment of sheer pride, or maybe just foolishly trying to impress a potential new military ally against future Assyrian threats, shows these Babylonian envoys absolutely everything.
Everything. He opens his entire treasury, his armory, his storehouses. He shows them all the gold.
He literally gives the future thieves a complete inventory of the house.
Exactly. And Isaiah comes to him afterward, finds out what happened, and delivers a chilling prophecy. He says, "The days are coming when everything in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left."
It's an absolute gut punch. After surviving the Assyrian meat grinder by the skin of their teeth, chapter 39 ends with this dark, looming warning that Babylon is going to be the ultimate ruin of Judah. The destruction is only delayed, not canceled.
But then you turn the page, you cross the boundary from chapter 39 into chapter 40, and the entire landscape of the book completely changes.
Right. You turn to chapter 40, and suddenly we are jumping through time. The Assyrian crisis of the 8th century is in the rearview mirror. We are no longer waiting for Babylon to attack. Babylon has already come.
Jerusalem has been destroyed. The temple is burned to the ground.
The exile has happened. The people have been dragged away into captivity. It's this massive, disorienting leap forward in history, which requires us to pull back the curtain and look at the actual literary structure of this masterpiece, because we have to ask, how did this massive book actually get put together?
The macro structure of the book of Isaiah is undeniably complex, and it is honestly one of the most fiercely debated topics in biblical scholarship. The deep dive maps it out into 3 major movements.
Let's break those down.
Chapters 1 through 39 focus on judgment, the failure of the kings, and the Assyrian crisis in the 8th century BCE. Then chapters 40 through 55 shift completely in tone and setting. They focus on comfort, the promise of a new exodus, and speak directly to the Babylonian exiles in the 6th century BCE.
And the final section.
Finally, chapters 56 through 66 deal with the realities of post-exilic worship and final hope, likely reflecting the 5th or 4th centuries BCE, after a remnant has actually returned to a ruined Jerusalem.
So we are talking about a timeline that spans several hundred years. So how does this work practically? Did the historical prophet Isaiah, the guy who confronted Ahaz in 740 BCE, sit at a desk in Jerusalem and write detailed chapters about the emotional state of exiles living in Babylon 200 years after his death?
This is the absolute crux of the authorship debate. Traditional conservative readers have historically affirmed a substantial unity, arguing that the 8th century prophet Isaiah was granted intense prophetic foresight to write the later chapters, essentially writing history in advance to comfort future generations.
They point to the fact that the text even predicts Cyrus of Persia by name long before he was born, right?
Exactly. However, modern historical critical scholarship commonly divides the book into three distinct works, written by different people at different times. They call them First Isaiah, covering chapters 1 to 39, Deutero-Isaiah, or Second Isaiah for 40-55, and Trito-Isaiah, or Third Isaiah for 56-66.
So different authors entirely.
This view argues that the later chapters were written by anonymous prophets living during the exile and post-exile, who attached their inspired work to the original Isaiah's tradition because they saw themselves as continuing his theological project.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Looking at this debate, I kept thinking of an analogy to make sense of how a single book can span centuries. Instead of picturing one author sitting alone at a desk furiously writing all 66 chapters, is it better to think of the book of Isaiah like a multi-generational European cathedral?
Oh, that is a fascinating visual. Walk me through the mechanics of that analogy.
Okay, so imagine a great cathedral like Notre Dame. The foundational architecture, the heavy stone walls of the nave, the original blueprint that was laid down by the master builder, the 8th century prophet Isaiah. That's chapters 139.
Okay, I'm with you.
But a cathedral takes centuries to build. Later generations of his school, his disciples, inherit this sacred space. And when their own historical crises hit, like the trauma of the Babylonian exile, they don't abandon the building. They add new wings to the cathedral. They put in new stained glass windows.
They are building on the exact same foundation.
Yes, using the exact same theological blueprints of God's holiness and sovereignty, but they are expanding the structure to speak directly into the trauma of their own time. So it's one unified cathedral, but it was built collaboratively over centuries.
That school-like transmission analogy perfectly captures the current consensus of many literary scholars. It allows us to respect the very real literary seams and the massive historical timeline jumps, while also affirming the profound, intentional canonical unity of the book.
Because the editors weren't just slapping things together.
Not at all. The editors who put this final version together weren't just randomly stapling scrolls together. They deliberately and beautifully stitched these different eras into a single, cohesive theological argument. They wanted the reader to see that the God who judged the arrogance of 8th century Jerusalem is the exact same God who will comfort the 6th century exiles.
And we know that this final, unified cathedral has been remarkably stable for a very long time, thanks again to archaeology. We have to talk about the great Isaiah scroll.
Yes, one Kiwisa. This is one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran Cave 1 by Bedouin shepherds in 1947.
It dates back to the 1st century BCE, right?
Yes, over 100 years before the birth of Jesus. It is the largest, best-preserved biblical scroll ever found at Qumran. It's 24 feet long. And the crucial paradigm-shifting point is that it contains all 66 chapters of Isaiah in one continuous scroll.
So long before the New Testament was written, long before medieval monks were copying texts, the book was already circulating as one complete, unified masterpiece. The seams between the centuries had already been smoothed out. The cathedral was finished and open for worship.
Precisely. The great Isaiah scroll proves that canonically, the book functioned as one massive, cohesive narrative. It forms a bridge between the complete collapse of the old order under Assyria and Babylon and the coming of a new, redemptive renewal.
So, having crossed that bridge into the second half of the book, we need to look at what chapters 40 to 55, the Deutero-Isaiah section, actually say, because we've left the arrogant wealth of King Hezekiah behind.
Completely behind.
We arrive in chapter 40, and the gold is gone. The temple is rubble. The people have been dragged hundreds of miles across the desert to Babylon. They have lost their land, their king, and their temple, the three pillars of their ancient identity. They are a traumatized, broken refugee population living in the shadow of a pagan empire. How does this text possibly offer them hope?
It begins with one of the most abrupt, beautiful, and emotionally overwhelming tone shifts in all of world literature. After 39 chapters of heavy judgment, terrifying covenant lawsuits, and prophecies of doom, Isaiah 40 verse 1 opens with a double imperative.
And what does it say?
A voice calls out, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God."
That is a staggering shift. After reading about fire and brimstone and siege ramps, the very first word God speaks into the silence of their exile is comfort. It completely rewrites the emotional landscape of the text.
The Hebrew root word is num, which means to console or to comfort deeply. It marks a massive theological pivot. God announces that Jerusalem's warfare has ended, that her iniquity has finally been pardoned.
A completely new beginning.
Yes, a voice cries out in the wilderness to prepare a highway. God is orchestrating a new exodus. Just as he brought them out of slavery in Egypt centuries before, God himself is returning to gather his broken people like a shepherd gathers his flock, carrying the lambs in his arms.
But Babylon is the most powerful empire on earth. How is God going to accomplish this impossible rescue? To do this, the text introduces two shocking, paradigm-shifting figures of salvation.
The first is a very real historical political figure, and the second is a deeply mysterious, almost mythic figure.
Let's start with the political shocker. The text introduces Cyrus the Great of Persia.
In chapters 44 and 45, we encounter some of the most radical, politically subversive theology in the ancient world. Yahweh, the God of the defeated, enslaved Israelite exiles, specifically names a pagan emperor, Cyrus the Persian, as his anointed instrument.
The Hebrew text literally calls Cyrus his Messiah, his anointed one.
Yes.
Wait, God takes the sacred title of Messiah, a title reserved for the kings of David's line, and gives it to a pagan Persian king who doesn't even worship him.
He does. God says to Cyrus, "I will go before you and level the exalted places. I call you by your name, I name you, though you do not know me." It is a staggering assertion of God's absolute, unrivaled sovereignty over global empires.
The Babylonians probably thought their gods, like Marduk, had defeated Yahweh because they destroyed Yahweh's temple.
Exactly. But Isaiah reveals the true reality behind the curtain of history. Yahweh orchestrated the Babylonian exile to purify his people, and now Yahweh is orchestrating the rise of the massive Persian Empire for one specific surgical purpose.
To open the bronze gates of Babylon, defeat their captors, and issue a decree letting the Jewish exiles go home.
Precisely.
God is just moving massive global empires around like pieces on a chessboard to save a tiny remnant of refugees. And Cyrus actually did this, right? Unlike the Assyrians who deported people to crush their identity, the Persian geopolitical strategy was to repatriate displaced peoples and let them rebuild their temples to keep them happy and paying taxes.
Exactly. Cyrus is the historical instrument of political and geographic liberation. He gets them out of the physical prison of Babylon. But the text recognizes a deeper problem.
Right, because physical freedom isn't everything.
Political liberation doesn't solve the internal rot. Cyrus can get the people back to Jerusalem, but he can't change their hearts. He can't fix the sin that caused the exile in the first place. For that deeper spiritual liberation, the text introduces the second, much more complex figure, the mysterious servant.
The Ek, the servant of Yahweh. These passages are known as the servant songs, found in chapters 42, 49, 50, and climaxing in 52 and 53. Who exactly is this servant? Because reading the text, the identity seems to shift and morph. It's incredibly complex.
It is a profound literary and theological progression. It operates kind of like a funnel, narrowing down as the chapters progress. Initially, in chapter 41 and 42, the text explicitly identifies the servant as corporate Israel. God says, "You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified."
The entire nation was given a vocation to be a light to the nations, a servant reflecting God's justice to the world.
But corporate Israel failed that vocation. That's why they ended up in exile. They were, as the text says, blind and deaf to God's covenant.
So the nation failed. What happens to the funnel?
The focus begins to narrow. The servant figure shifts from the whole rebellious nation to a faithful remnant within the nation. And then climactically, in chapters 52 and 53, the funnel narrows to a single representative individual.
An individual who will step in and do what the nation completely failed to do.
Yes. And the method this individual servant uses to save the world is completely, shockingly unexpected. Let's look closely at chapter 53, the famous suffering servant passage.
It's arguably the most famous part of the book.
It is the absolute pinnacle of the book's theological development. The text describes a figure who has no majestic beauty to attract us to him. He's despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief.
And then comes the theological core.
He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed.
So put yourself in the sandals of an ancient Israelite. You are waiting for ultimate rescue. You've seen Assyrian kings with battering rams. You've seen Babylonian warlords burn your city. You naturally expect your ultimate savior, your true Messiah, to be a mighty warrior on a war horse.
With a bigger sword, coming to violently slaughter your enemies and restore the empire.
Right. But instead, Isaiah says ultimate rescue comes through someone who is physically crushed. Someone who suffers silently, doesn't fight back, and voluntarily takes the guilt of the rebellious people upon himself. How does a defeated dying servant bring victory?
That is the genius of Isaiah. It completely upends the ancient world's entire conception of power. The idea that salvation and cosmic victory come not through military conquest, not through the sword, but through substitutionary atonement-like suffering. That this innocent servant bears the grief, the transgression, and the guilt of the many to bring healing is a staggering, revolutionary concept.
It redefines what it means to conquer.
It does. True victory over evil is achieved through ultimate, self-giving sacrifice.
Which is exactly why this specific concept, a suffering servant who brings cosmic peace through his own wounds, became the absolute bedrock foundation for the New Testament. You literally cannot understand the New Testament or the claims of early Christianity without understanding Isaiah.
This brings us to the theological hinge of our analysis, the Christological application of Isaiah. It is impossible to overstate Isaiah's influence on early Christian theology. Isaiah is among the most heavily cited Old Testament books by the writers of the New Testament.
They used it as the primary lens to understand who Jesus was and what his death actually accomplished.
Exactly. The connections are everywhere. We have the prophecy of the shoot from the stump of Jesse in chapter 11, the righteous Davidic king who has the Spirit of God resting on him.
We have the voice crying in the wilderness from chapter 40, which all four Gospels apply directly to John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. We have the incredible child king prophecy, chapter 9. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
And we must address one of the most famous, heavily debated interpretive issues in the entire biblical text, Isaiah 7.14, the Emmanuel prophecy.
Ah, yes, the virgin birth prophecy.
Yeah.
Let's really get into the weeds on the mechanics of this one. What does the original Hebrew text actually say, and how did it become the foundation for the Christmas story?
The debate centers on the specific Hebrew word used in Isaiah 7.14, which is Alma, in its immediate historical 8th century context. Remember, this is when Isaiah is speaking to the terrified King Ahaz during the Syro-Ephraimite War. Alma simply denoted a young woman of marriageable age.
So it does not explicitly mean a biological virgin.
Not inherently in Hebrew, no. The immediate sign to Ahaz was that a young woman in the royal court would conceive and bear a son named Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. And before that normal human child was old enough to know right from wrong, the two kings terrifying Ahaz would be destroyed.
So the original prophecy had a very specific immediate historical fulfillment in 734 BCE. It was basically a ticking clock for Ahaz's political enemies.
Correct. The sign was about the timing of God's deliverance, not necessarily a miraculous biological conception. However, the linguistic shift happens a few centuries later.
When they translated the text.
Yes. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the translation known as the Septuagint, produced in Alexandria, the Jewish scholars translating the text chose the Greek word parthenos to translate Alma, and parthenos does specifically mean virgin.
Okay, so the Greek translation narrows the meaning.
Yes, and canonically and Christologically, the Gospel of Matthew, writing in Greek, takes this specific passage and applies it directly to the miraculous virgin birth of Jesus. Matthew sees the ultimate, exhaustive fulfillment of the concept of God with us, not in a sign child in Ahaz's court, but in the actual literal incarnation of God in Jesus.
And it's not just explicit prophecies like the virgin birth or the suffering servant. The New Testament writers basically hijacked Isaiah's entire symbolic vocabulary to describe their new reality.
They absolutely did.
The imagery of a great light piercing into deep darkness. The promise of living water poured out on thirsty ground. The vision of an eschatological banquet on God's mountain where death is finally swallowed up forever. The cornerstone that the builders rejected becoming the foundation. The vineyard. Jesus and his apostles used Isaiah's exact paintbrush to paint their picture of the church and the kingdom of God. But this immense reliance on Isaiah by the early Christians raises a crucial, structural, interpretive question about how we read the text today. Right, and this is exactly what a skeptical reader or historian might ask. If we were reading the book of Isaiah completely in a vacuum, without the New Testament, without any knowledge of Jesus of Nazareth or the last 2,000 years of Christianity, if we just had the ancient Hebrew scrolls from Qumran, would we still see these passages as pointing toward a single messianic savior who dies for the sins of the world? It's a fair question. Or is that entire framework just a retroactive Christian lens being aggressively forced backward onto a Jewish text that originally meant something completely different?
That is a deeply important question regarding textual integrity. To answer it objectively based on the literary structure of the book, the messianic expectation was absolutely not a Christian invention. It is deeply, fundamentally embedded in the architecture of the Hebrew text itself.
So it's baked in from the start.
Even if you completely erase the New Testament, when you read the 66 chapters of Isaiah, you see a deliberate forward-looking trajectory. You see the catastrophic failure of the current Davidic kings like Ahaz and Hezekiah. And in response to that failure, the text explicitly points forward to a future, idealized, righteous Davidic ruler who will possess the Spirit of God in full, who will restore pure justice, and who will bring a cosmic Eden-like peace, as we see vividly described in chapter 11.
And the same applies to the servant.
Exactly. You see the failure of the corporate nation of Israel as the servant, and the text explicitly points forward to an individual servant who will succeed where the nation failed, who will suffer unjustly, and who will vindicate the many, as in chapter 53. The trajectory of a coming king who establishes justice and a coming servant who suffers to bring healing is undeniable in the Hebrew source material.
So the puzzle pieces were already cut, painted, and laid out on the table by the 8th and 6th century prophets. They were just waiting for someone to assemble them.
The New Testament writers didn't invent the theological categories of a coming king, a suffering servant, or a light to the nations. Isaiah supplied the exact vocabulary, the profound theological scaffolding that early Christians later recognized and utilized to explain the unprecedented person and work of Jesus.
They looked at Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and they realized that he was the ultimate synthesis of all these diverse Isaianic trajectories. He was the king and the suffering servant in one person.
Beautifully said.
Okay, so we've traveled an immense distance. We started at the 8th century Assyrian siege ramps. We walked through the despair of the Babylonian exile, and we traced the theological threads all the way to the 1st century New Testament application. But before we finish, I want to pull all of this ancient history and theology right into the lap of the modern listener.
Make it practical.
Exactly. Because if this is just ancient history, it belongs in a museum. Why does a 2,700-year-old scroll matter to someone listening to this deep dive while driving to work or doing the dishes today?
It matters intensely because human nature, the deep psychological drivers of society, and the structures of power we build have not fundamentally changed since the 8th century BCE. The profound resonance of Isaiah is that its ancient themes map directly and somewhat uncomfortably onto the modern world.
Let's look at the first major theme we discussed, political idolatry. The central warning to Ahaz and Hezekiah was that human states and military alliances cannot secure ultimate safety.
And we still struggle with this exact same temptation constantly. We live in a deeply anxious era where people put absolute, almost messianic trust in political machinations, in technological progress, or in military and economic supremacy.
They are simply the modern equivalents of Egypt's chariots and horses.
Isaiah's warning remains active. Putting our ultimate hope in these human structures is a form of idolatry, and because they are built by flawed humans, they will inevitably fracture and fail us.
And then there's the blistering theological mandate for social justice. We spent a lot of time defining Mifat. Isaiah makes it incredibly clear that protecting the vulnerable is not a side issue or a political talking point. It is the core test of a society's soul.
It's foundational.
Think about your own news feed today. We still see massive systemic economic stratification. We still see legal and economic systems that exploit the vulnerable, while a small elite accumulates staggering wealth. When you read Isaiah chapter 5, describing those who add house to house and join field to field until there is no more room, it reads exactly like a critique of modern corporate greed and predatory real estate practices.
Which ties directly into the danger of religious hypocrisy, the hypocritical liturgy we discussed in chapter 1. The performative morality we see today is identical.
We see leaders and individuals claiming a high moral or religious ground, performing all the right cultural rituals, while actively participating in or passively ignoring the crushing of the poor.
Isaiah reminds us that God is kadosh, fiercely holy, and he completely despises that kind of performative, unjust worship.
I also think the psychological aspects of the book are incredibly relevant. The text uses the language of exile, literally, regarding Babylon. But today, exile maps perfectly onto modern psychology.
That's a great point.
Most of us aren't facing physical deportation by an empire, but there is a pervasive, almost universal modern feeling of displacement. We experience profound cultural alienation, loneliness, and trauma. We feel like we are wandering in a wilderness, disconnected from community and meaning.
And this is where the genius of the book's final structure comes into play. Isaiah provides not just a piercing critique of our failures, but a robust framework for hope. The final chapters of the book, 56 through 66, acknowledge the stark, painful reality of human suffering.
They don't offer a shallow, everything is fine optimism.
No, but they absolutely insist that the final word of human history is not ruin, exile, or death. The final word, as described in chapter 65, is a new heavens and a new earth.
It's a vision of ultimate restoration. The Hebrew word is shalom, and we often translate shalom simply as peace, meaning a cessation of violence.
Yeah.
But the concept is so much deeper than that.
Much deeper.
Halom means restored order. It means absolute wholeness. It is a vision of the world and human relationships, functioning exactly as the Creator originally designed them to function. It's the vision of chapter 11, where the wolf lies down with the lamb, where the predatory nature of the world is fundamentally healed.
But arriving at that vision forces us to confront a deeply challenging question. If we look at the massive sweep of this ancient text, the cycle of corruption, judgment, and the desperate need for rescue, and then we look at our own world today, has human nature actually evolved or changed since 740 BCE?
That is the question I want you, the listener, to really think about. Look at the pride, the deep-seated fear of losing control, the frantic grasping for power and security, the tendency to build up our own little empires at the expense of the weak. Have we actually evolved past the people walking the stone streets of ancient Jerusalem?
The profound and somewhat tragic conclusion of Isaiah's analysis of history is that no, human nature remains fundamentally fallen. It remains driven by pride, self-reliance, and a gravitational pull toward injustice.
It's a dark diagnosis.
But paradoxically, that dark diagnosis makes the enduring significance of this book even more powerful. Because Isaiah's ultimate answer to the human condition is not a self-help manual. It doesn't just say, try harder to be good. His answer is a radical insistence on grace.
It has to come from the outside.
It is the divine initiative, the servant voluntarily suffering in our place, God stepping into the filth and violence of human history to do for us what we are completely incapable of doing for ourselves. That divine intervention is the only thing that can actually fundamentally transform the human heart.
It's the only way to actually break the cycle. It's the only way out of the meat grinder.
Building on that, it's the realization that true security was never going to be found in the walls we built to protect ourselves, but in the vulnerability of trusting a God who is both perfectly just and incomprehensibly merciful.
We have taken an absolutely massive journey today. We started by staring down the terrifying literal siege ramps of the Assyrian war machine. We walked through the hypocritical, incense-filled temple courts of Judah.
We sat in the dust and the profound psychological despair of the Babylonian exile.
And finally, we looked up into the soaring cosmic hope of a suffering servant who absorbs the violence of the world to bring about a completely new creation. It is a staggering masterpiece of literature, history, and theology.
And because of its depth and its piercing insight into the human condition, it demands a response from the reader. You cannot read the book of Isaiah, truly engage with its claims, and remain neutral. It forces you to choose where you place your trust.
You really can't remain neutral. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on the entire architecture of the book we've just discussed, but throws a beautiful, unexpected curveball at the very end.
Let's hear it.
We talked earlier about how the book of Isaiah starts with this furious, exclusive covenant lawsuit. Chapter 1 is an aggressive indictment against the ultimate insiders, the chosen people of Judah, for breaking the strict internal rules of their covenant with God. The beginning of the book is very much focused on who is in the community and how they have failed.
Yes, chapters 1 through 5 are intensely, almost exclusively focused on the internal boundaries and the purity of the Israelite community. It is an internal family dispute.
But then you walk through the centuries of history. You arrive at the very end of our cathedral analogy. You walk into the final wing, chapters 56 and 66, and there is a shocking twist waiting for you.
The inclusion of the outsider.
Yes. In an ancient world defined by brutal tribal warfare, a world governed by incredibly strict, exclusionary purity laws that separated people based on ethnicity and physical wholeness, God suddenly throws the heavy doors of the temple wide open. The text explicitly declares that foreigners and eunuchs, people who were historically, legally, and culturally the ultimate outsiders, the very people strictly excluded from the assembly of God by ancient law, are now fully joyfully welcomed to his holy mountain.
The book ends with a breathtaking cosmic vision of all flesh, every nation, every language, every kind of marginalized person worshiping together in perfect shalom.
It is a radical, boundary-breaking vision of inclusion that completely shatters the old, exclusionary paradigms of the ancient world. It anticipates a kingdom where grace overrides strict legal purity. So here is the question to take with you today. If an ancient text, born in an era of literal tribal warfare and imperial meat grinders, a text obsessed with blazing moral purity and holiness, can somehow end with a vision of radical, boundary-breaking inclusion, what boundaries in our own world, what walls that we've built to decide who is in and who is out are we clinging to that are actually meant to be broken?
A phenomenal and deeply challenging question to ponder.
Thank you so much for taking this extensive deep dive with us today. We hope it illuminated the text and gave you a new perspective on history. Keep questioning the narratives around you, keep exploring the hidden layers of history, and as always, keep seeking the bigger picture. We'll see you next time.